That is a Spanish name, I think. He was a Catalan. You imagine him capable of writing the letter? Oh, no. He would more likely have got rid of me by sticking a knife into me. That is in strict accordance with the Spanish character. An assassination they will unhesitatingly commit, but an act of cowardice, never. Besides, said Dantes, the various circumstances mentioned in the letter were wholly unknown to him. You had never spoken of them yourself to anyone? To no one. Not even to your mistress? No, not even to my betrothed. Then it is Danglars. I feel quite sure of it now. Wait a little. Pray, was Danglars acquainted with Fernand? No. Yes, he was. Now I recollect. What? To have seen them both sitting at table together under an arbor at pt5 the evening before the day fixed for my wedding. They were in earnest conversation. Danglars was joking in a friendly way, but Fernand looked pale and agitated. Were they alone? There was a third person with them, whom I knew perfectly well, and who had, in all probability, made their acquaintance. He was a tailor named Caderousse, but he was very drunk. Stay! How strange that it should not have occurred to me before! Now I remember quite well that on the table round which they were sitting were pens, ink, and paper. Oh, the heartless, treacherous scoundrels! Exclaimed Dantes, pressing his hand to his throbbing brows. Is there anything else I can assist you in discovering, besides the villainy of your friends? Inquired the Abbé with a laugh. Yes, replied Dantes eagerly. I would beg of you, who see so completely to the depth of things, and to whom the greatest mystery seems but an easy riddle, to explain to me how it was that I underwent no second examination, was never brought to trial, and above all, was condemned without ever having had sentence passed on me. That is altogether a different and more serious matter, responded the Abbé. The ways of justice are frequently too dark and mysterious to be easily penetrated. All we have hitherto done in the matter has been child's play. If you wish me to enter upon the more difficult part of the business, you must assist me by the most minute information on every point. Pray ask me whatever questions you please, for in good truth you see more clearly into my life than I do myself. In the first place, then, who examined you? The king's attorney, his deputy, or a magistrate? The deputy. Was he young or old? About 6 or 7 and 20 years of age, I should say. So, answered the Abbé, old enough to be ambitious, but too young to be corrupt. And how did he treat you? With more of mildness than severity. Did you tell him your whole story? I did. And did his conduct change at all in the course of your examination? He did appear much disturbed when he read the letter that had brought me into this scrape. He seemed quite overcome by my misfortune. By your misfortune? Yes. Then you feel quite sure that it was your misfortune he deplored. He gave me one great proof of his sympathy at any rate. And that? He burnt the sole evidence that could have at all incriminated me. What, the accusation? No, the letter. Are you sure? I saw it done. That alters the case. This man might after all be a greater scoundrel than you have thought possible. Upon my word, said Dantes, you make me shudder. Is the world filled with tigers and crocodiles? Yes, and remember that 2-legged tigers and crocodiles are more dangerous than the others. Never mind, let us go on. With all my heart, you tell me he burned the letter? He did, saying at the same time, you see, I thus destroy the only proof existing against you. This action is somewhat too sublime to be natural. You think so? I am sure of it. To whom was this letter addressed? To Monsieur Noirtier, number 13, Coq Heron, Paris. Now, can you conceive of any interest that your heroic deputy could possibly have had in the destruction of that letter? Why, it is not altogether impossible. He might have had, for he made me promise several times never to speak of that letter to anyone, assuring me he so advised me for my own interest. And more than this, he insisted on my taking a solemn oath never to utter the name mentioned in the address. Noirtier, repeated the Abbé. Noirtier. I knew a person of that name at the Count of the Queen of Etruria, a Noirtier, who had been a Girondin during the Revolution. What was your deputy called? De Villefort. The Abbé burst into a fit of laughter, while Dantes gazed on him in utter astonishment. What ails you? He said at length. Do you see that ray of sunlight? I do. Well, the whole thing is more clear to me than that sunbeam is to you. Poor fellow, you poor young man, and you tell me this magistrate expressed great sympathy and commiseration for you? He did. And the worthy man destroyed your compromising letter? Yes. Why, you poor, short-sighted simpleton, can you not guess who this Noirtier was, whose very name he was so careful to keep concealed? Noirtier was his father. Had a thunderbolt fallen at the feet of Dantes, or hell opened its yawning gulf before him, he could not have been more completely transfixed with horror than he was at the sound of these unexpected words. Starting up, he clasped his hands around his head as though to prevent his very brain from bursting, and exclaimed, His father! His father? Yes, his father, replied the Abbé. His right name was Noirtier de Villefort. At this instant a bright light shot through the mind of Dantes, and cleared up all that had been dark and obscure before. The change that had come over Villefort during the examination, the destruction of the letter, the exacted promise, the almost supplicating tones of the magistrate, who seemed rather to implore mercy than to pronounce punishment, all returned with a stunning force to his memory. He cried out, and staggered against the wall like a drunken man. Then he hurried to the opening that led from the Abbé's cell to his own, and said, I must be alone to think over all this. When he regained his dungeon, he threw himself on his bed, where the turnkey found him in the evening visit, sitting with fixed gaze and contracted features, dumb and motionless as a statue. During these hours of profound meditation, which to him had seemed only minutes, he had formed a fearful resolution, and bound himself to its fulfillment by a solemn oath. Dantes was at length roused from his reverie by the voice of Faria, who, having also been visited by his jailer, had come to invite his fellow-sufferer to share his supper. The reputation of being out of his mind, though harmlessly, and even amusingly so, had procured for the Abbé unusual privileges. He was supplied with bread of a finer, whiter quality than the usual prison fare, and even regaled each Sunday with a small quantity of wine. Now this was a Sunday, and the Abbé had come to ask his young companion to share the luxuries with him. Dantes followed. His features were no longer contracted, and now wore their usual expression. But there was that in his whole appearance that bespoke one who had come to a fixed and desperate resolve. Faria bent on him his penetrating eye. I regret now, said he, having helped you in your late inquiries, or having given you the information I did. Why so? Inquired Dantes. Because it has instilled a new passion in your heart, that of vengeance. Dantes smiled. Let us talk of something else, said he. Again the Abbé looked at him, then mournfully shook his head, but in accordance with Dantes' request, he began to speak of other matters. The elder prisoner was one of those persons whose conversation, like that of all who have experienced many trials, contained many useful and important hints, as well as sound information. But it was never egotistical, for the unfortunate man never alluded to his own sorrows. Dantes listened with admiring attention to all he said. Some of his remarks corresponded with what he already knew, or applied to the sort of knowledge his nautical life had enabled him to acquire. A part of the good Abbé's words, however, were wholly incomprehensible to him, but like the aurora which guides the navigator in northern latitudes, opened new vistas to the inquiring mind of the listener, and gave fantastic glimpses of new horizons, enabling him justly to estimate the delight an intellectual mind would have in following one so richly gifted as Faria along the heights of truth, where he was so much at home. "You must teach me a small part of what you know," said Dantes, "if only to prevent your growing weary of me. I can well believe that so learned a person as yourself would prefer absolute solitude to being tormented with the company of one as ignorant and uninformed as myself. If you will only agree to my request, I promise you never to mention another word about escaping." The abbé smiled. "Alas, my boy," said he, "human knowledge is confined within very narrow limits, and when I have taught you mathematics, physics, history, and the 3 or 4 modern languages with which I am acquainted, you will know as much as I do myself. Now, it will scarcely require 2 years for me to communicate to you the stock of learning I possess." "2 years!" exclaimed Dantes. "Do you really believe I can acquire all these things in so short a time?" "Not their applications, certainly, but their principles you may. To learn is not to know. There are the learners and the learned. Memory makes the one, philosophy the other." "But cannot one learn philosophy?" "Philosophy cannot be taught. It is the application of the sciences to truth. It is like the golden cloud in which the Messiah went up to heaven." "Well, then," said Dantes, "what shall you teach me first? I am in a hurry to begin. I want to learn." "Everything," said the abbé, and that very evening the prisoner sketched a plan of education to be entered upon the following day. Dantes possessed a prodigious memory, combined with an astonishing quickness and readiness of conception. The mathematical turn of his mind rendered him apt at all kinds of calculation, while his naturally poetical feelings threw a light and pleasing veil over the dry reality of arithmetical computation, or the rigid severity of geometry. He already knew Italian, and had also picked up a little of the romantic dialect during voyages to the East, and by the aid of these 2 languages he easily comprehended the construction of all the others, so that at the end of 6 months he began to speak Spanish, English, and German. In strict accordance with the promise made to the abbé, Dantes spoke no more of escape. Perhaps the delight his studies afforded him left no room for such thoughts. Perhaps the recollection that he had pledged his word, on which his sense of honor was keen, kept him from referring in any way to the possibilities of flight. Days, even months, passed by unheeded in one rapid and instructive course. At the end of a year, Dantes was a new man. Dantes observed, however, that Faria, in spite of the relief his society afforded, daily grew sadder. One thought seemed incessantly to harass and distract his mind. Sometimes he would fall into long reveries, sigh heavily and involuntarily, then suddenly rise, and with folded arms began pacing the confined space of his dungeon. One day he stopped all at once and exclaimed, "Oh, if there were no sentinel!" "There shall not be one a minute longer than you please," said Dantes, who had followed the workings of his thoughts as accurately as though his brain were enclosed in crystal, so clear as to display its minutest operation. "I have already told you," answered the abbé, "that I loathe the idea of shedding blood. And yet the murder, if you choose to call it so, would be simply a measure of self-preservation. No matter, I could never agree to it." "Still, you have thought of it." "Incessantly, alas!" cried the abbé. "And you have discovered a means of regaining our freedom, have you not?" asked Dantes eagerly. "I have. If it were only possible to place a deaf and blind sentinel in the gallery beyond us." "He shall be both blind and deaf," replied the young man, with an air of determination that made his companion shudder. "No, no," cried the abbé. "Impossible." Dantes endeavored to renew the subject. The abbé shook his head in token of disapproval, and refused to make any further response. 3 months passed away. "Are you strong?" the Abbé asked one day of Dantes. The young man, in reply, took up the chisel, bent it into the form of a horseshoe, and then as readily straightened it. "And will you engage not to do any harm to the sentry, except as a last resort?" "I promise on my honor." "Then," said the Abbé, "we may hope to put our design into execution." "And how long shall we be in accomplishing the necessary work?" "At least a year." "And shall we begin at once?" "At once." "We have lost a year to no purpose," cried Dantes. "Do you consider the last 12 months to have been wasted?" asked the Abbé. "Forgive me," cried Edmund, blushing deeply. "Tut, tut," answered the Abbé. "Man is but man after all, and you are about the best specimen of the genus I have ever known. Come, let me show you my plan." The Abbé then showed Dantes the sketch he had made for their escape. It consisted of a plan of his own cell and that of Dantes, with the passage which united them. In this passage he proposed to drive a level, as they do in mines. This level would bring the 2 prisoners immediately beneath the gallery, where the sentry kept watch. Once there, a large excavation would be made, and one of the flagstones with which the gallery was paved be so completely loosened that at the desired moment it would give way beneath the feet of the soldier, who, stunned by his fall, would be immediately bound and gagged by Dantes before he had power to offer any resistance. The prisoners were then to make their way through one of the gallery windows, and to let themselves down from the outer walls by means of the Abbé's ladder of cords. Dante's eyes sparkled with joy, and he rubbed his hands with delight at the idea of a plan so simple, yet apparently so certain to succeed. That very day the miners began their labors, with a vigor and alacrity proportionate to their long rest from fatigue and their hopes of ultimate success. Nothing interrupted the progress of the work, except the necessity that each was under of returning to his cell in anticipation of the turnkey's visit. They had learned to distinguish the almost imperceptible sound of his footsteps as he descended towards their dungeons, and happily never failed of being prepared for his coming. The fresh earth excavated during their present work, and which would have entirely blocked up the old passage, was thrown, by degrees and with the utmost precaution, out of the window, in either Faria's or Dante's cell, the rubbish being first pulverized so finely that the night wind carried it far away without permitting the smallest trace to remain. More than a year had been consumed in this undertaking, the only tools for which had been a chisel, a knife, and a wooden lever. Faria still continuing to instruct Dantes by conversing with him, sometimes in one language, sometimes in another, at others relating to him the history of nations and great men who from time to time have risen to fame and trodden the path of glory. The Abbé was a man of the world, and had moreover mixed in the first society of the day. He wore an air of melancholy dignity, which Dantes, thanks to the imitative powers bestowed on him by nature, easily acquired, as well as that outward polish and politeness he had before been wanting in, and which is seldom possessed except by those who have been placed in constant intercourse with persons of high birth and breeding. At the end of 15 months the level was finished, and the excavation completed beneath the gallery, and the 2 workmen could distinctly hear the measured tread of the sentinel as he paced to and fro over their heads. Compelled as they were to await a night sufficiently dark to favor their flight, they were obliged to defer their final attempt till that auspicious moment should arrive. Their greatest dread now was lest the stone through which the sentry was doomed to fall should give way before its right time, and this they had in some measure provided against by propping it up with a small beam which they had discovered in the walls through which they had worked their way. Dantes was occupied in arranging this piece of wood when he heard Faria, who had remained in Edmund's cell for the purpose of cutting a peg to secure their rope ladder, call to him in a tone indicative of great suffering. Dantes hastened to his dungeon, where he found him standing in the middle of the room, pale as death, his forehead streaming with perspiration, and his hands clenched tightly together. "Gracious heavens!" exclaimed Dante. "What is the matter? What has happened?" "Quick, quick," returned the abbé. "Listen to what I have to say." Dantes looked in fear and wonder at the livid countenance of Faria, whose eyes, already dull and sunken, were surrounded by purple circles, while his lips were white as those of a corpse, and his very hair seemed to stand on end. "Tell me, I beseech you, what ails you?" cried Dantes, letting his chisel fall to the floor. "Alas," faltered out the abbé, "all is over with me. I am seized with a terrible, perhaps mortal illness. I can feel that the paroxysm is fast approaching. I had a similar attack the year previous to my imprisonment. This malady admits but of one remedy. I will tell you what that is. Go into my cell as quickly as you can. Draw out one of the feet that support the bed. You will find it has been hollowed out for the purpose of containing a small phial. You will see they're half filled with a red-looking fluid. Bring it to me. Or rather, no. I may be found here. Therefore, help me back to my room while I have the strength to drag myself along. Who knows what may happen, or how long the attack may last?" In spite of the magnitude of the misfortune which thus suddenly frustrated his hopes, Dantes did not lose his presence of mind, but descended into the passage, dragging his unfortunate companion with him. Then, half carrying, half supporting him, he managed to reach the abbé's chamber, when he immediately laid the sufferer on his bed. "Thanks," said the poor abbé, shivering as though his veins were filled with ice. "I am about to be seized with a fit of catalepsy. When it comes to its height, I shall probably lie still and motionless, as though dead, uttering neither sigh nor groan. On the other hand, the symptoms may be much more violent, and cause me to fall into fearful convulsions, foam at the mouth, and cry out loudly. Take care my cries are not heard, for if they are, it is more than probable I should be removed to another part of the prison, and we be separated forever. When I become quite motionless, cold, and rigid as a corpse, then, and not before, be careful about this, force open my teeth with a knife, pour from 8 to 10 drops of the liquor contained in the phial down my throat, and I may perhaps revive." "Perhaps!" exclaimed Dantes in grief-stricken tones. "Help! Help!" cried the abbé. I die." So sudden and violent was the fit that the unfortunate prisoner was unable to complete the sentence. A violent convulsion shook his whole frame. His eyes stared from their sockets, his mouth was drawn on one side, his cheeks became purple. He struggled, foamed, dashed himself about, and uttered the most dreadful cries, which, however, Dantes prevented from being heard by covering his head with the blanket. The fit lasted 2 hours. Then, more helpless than an infant, and colder and paler than marble, more crushed and broken than a reed trampled underfoot, he fell back, doubled up in one last convulsion, and became as rigid as a corpse. Edmund waited till life seemed extinct in the body of his friend. Then, taking up a knife, he with difficulty forced open the closely fixed jaws, carefully administered the appointed number of drops, and anxiously awaited the result. An hour passed away, and the old man gave no sign of returning animation. Dantes began to fear he had delayed too long ere he administered the remedy, and thrusting his hands into his hair, continued gazing on the lifeless features of his friend. At length, a slight color tinged the livid cheeks. Consciousness returned to the dull open eyeballs, a faint sigh issued from the lips, and the sufferer made a feeble effort to move. "He is saved! He is saved!" cried Dantes in a paroxysm of delight. The sick man was not yet able to speak, but he pointed with evident anxiety towards the door. Dantes listened, and plainly distinguished the approaching steps of the jailer. It was therefore near 7 o'clock, but Edmund's anxiety had put all thoughts of time out of his head. The young man sprang to the entrance, darted through it, carefully drawing the stone over the opening, and hurried to his cell. He had scarcely done so before the door opened, and the jailer saw the prisoner seated as usual on the side of his bed. Almost before the key had turned in the lock, and before the departing steps of the jailer had died away in the long corridor he had to traverse, Dante's, whose restless anxiety concerning his friend left him no desire to touch the food brought him, hurried back to the abbé's chamber, and raising the stone by pressing his head against it, was soon beside the sick man's couch. Faria had now fully regained his consciousness, but he still lay helpless and exhausted. "I did not expect to see you again," he said feebly to Dantes. "And why not?" asked the young man. "Did you fancy yourself dying?" "No, I had no such idea. But knowing that all was ready for flight, I thought you might have made your escape." The deep glow of indignation suffused the cheeks of Dantes. "Without you? Did you really think me capable of that?" "At least," said the abbé, "I now see how wrong such an opinion would have been. Alas, alas, I am fearfully exhausted and debilitated by this attack." "Be of good cheer," replied Dantes. "Your strength will return." And as he spoke, he seated himself near the bed beside Faria, and took his hands. The abbé shook his head. "The last attack I had," said he, "lasted but half an hour, and after it I was hungry, and got up without help. Now I can move neither my right arm nor leg, and my head seems uncomfortable, which shows that there has been a suffusion of blood on the brain. The third attack will either carry me off, or leave me paralyzed for life." "No," cried Dantes, "you are mistaken. You will not die, and your third attack, if indeed you should have another, will find you at liberty. We shall save you another time, as we have done this, only with a better chance of success, because we shall be able to command every requisite assistance." "My good Edmund," answered the abbé, "be not deceived. The attack which has just passed away condemns me forever to the walls of a prison. None can fly from a dungeon who cannot walk." "Well, we will wait. A week, a month, 2 months if need be, and meanwhile your strength will return. Everything is in readiness for our flight, and we can select any time we choose. As soon as you feel able to swim, we will go." "I shall never swim again," replied Faria. "This arm is paralyzed, not for a time, but forever. Lift it, and judge if I am mistaken." The young man raised the arm, which fell back by its own weight, perfectly inanimate and helpless. A sigh escaped him. "You are convinced now, Edmund, are you not?" asked the abbé. "Depend upon it, I know what I say. Since the first attack I experienced of this malady, I have continually reflected on it. Indeed, I expected it, for it is a family inheritance. Both my father and grandfather died of it in a third attack. The physician who prepared for me the remedy I have twice successfully taken was no other than the celebrated Cabanis, and he predicted a similar end for me." "The physician may be mistaken," exclaimed Dantes. "And as for your poor arm, what difference will that make? I can take you on my shoulders and swim for both of us." "My son," said the abbé, "you, who are a sailor and a swimmer, must know as well as I do that a man so loaded would sink before he had done 50 strokes. Cease, then, to allow yourself to be duped by vain hopes that even your own excellent heart refuses to believe in. Here I shall remain till the hour of my deliverance arrives, and that, in all human probability, will be the hour of my death. As for you, who are young and active, delay not on my account, but fly. Go. I give you back your promise." "It is well," said Dantes. "Then I shall also remain." Then, rising and extending his hand with an air of solemnity over the old man's head, he slowly added, "By the blood of Christ, I swear never to leave you while you live." Faria gazed fondly on his noble-minded, single-hearted, high-principled young friend, and read in his countenance ample confirmation of the sincerity of his devotion and the loyalty of his purpose. "Thanks," murmured the invalid, extending one hand. "I accept. You may one of these days reap the reward of your disinterested devotion, but as I cannot, and you will not, quit this place, it becomes necessary to fill up the excavation beneath the soldier's gallery. You might, by chance, hear the hollow sound of his footsteps, and call the attention of his officer to the circumstance. That would bring about a discovery which would inevitably lead to our being separated. Go, then, and set about this work, in which unhappily I can offer you no assistance. Keep at it all night if necessary, and do not return here tomorrow, till after the jailer has visited me. I shall have something of the greatest importance to communicate to you." Dantes took the hand of the abbé in his, and affectionately pressed it. Faria smiled encouragingly on him, and the young man retired to his task, in the spirit of obedience and respect which he had sworn to show towards his aged friend. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 18. The Treasure. When Dantes returned next morning to the chamber of his companion in captivity, he found Faria seated and looking composed. In the ray of light which entered by the narrow window of his cell, he held open in his left hand, of which alone it will be recollected he retained the use, a sheet of paper which, from being constantly rolled into a small compass, had the form of a cylinder, and was not easily kept open. He did not speak, but showed the paper to Dantes. "What is that?" he inquired. "Look at it," said the abbé with a smile. "I have looked at it with all possible attention," said Dantes, "and I only see a half-burnt paper, on which are traces of Gothic characters inscribed with a peculiar kind of ink." "This paper, my friend," said Faria, "I may now avow to you, since I have the proof of your fidelity. This paper is my treasure, of which, from this day forth, 1/2 belongs to you." The sweat started forth on Dante's brow. Until this day, and for how long a time, he had refrained from talking of the treasure, which had brought upon the abbé the accusation of madness. With his instinctive delicacy, Edmond had preferred avoiding any touch on this painful chord, and Faria had been equally silent. He had taken the silence of the old man for a return to reason, and now these few words uttered by Faria, after so painful a crisis, seemed to indicate a serious relapse into mental alienation. "Your treasure?" stammered Dantes. Faria smiled. "Yes," said he. "You have indeed a noble nature, Edmond, and I see by your paleness and agitation what is passing in your heart at this moment. No, be assured I am not mad. This treasure exists, Dantes, and if I have not been allowed to possess it, you will. Yes, you. No one would listen or believe me, because everyone thought me mad. But you, who must know that I am not, listen to me, and believe me so afterwards, if you will." "Alas," murmured Edmund to himself, "this is a terrible relapse. There was only this blow wanting." Then he said aloud, "My dear friend, your attack has, perhaps, fatigued you. Had you not better repose a while? To-morrow, if you will, I will hear your narrative, but to-day I wish to nurse you carefully. Besides," he said, "a treasure is not a thing we need hurry about." "On the contrary, it is a matter of the utmost importance, Edmond," replied the old man. "Who knows if to-morrow, or the next day after, the third attack may not come on, and then must not all be over? Yes, indeed, I have often thought with a bitter joy that these riches, which would make the wealth of a dozen families, will be for ever lost to those men who persecute me. This idea was one of vengeance to me, and I tasted it slowly, in the night of my dungeon and the despair of my captivity. But now I have forgiven the world for the love of you, now that I see you young and with a promising future, now that I think of all that may result to you in the good fortune of such a disclosure, I shudder at any delay, and tremble lest I should not assure to one as worthy as yourself the possession of so vast an amount of hidden wealth." Edmond turned away his head with a sigh. "You persist in your incredulity, Edmond," continued Faria. "My words have not convinced you. I see you require proofs. Well, then, read this paper, which I have never shown to any one." "To-morrow, my dear friend," said Edmond, desirous of not yielding to the old man's madness. "I thought it was understood that we should not talk of that until to-morrow." "Then we will not talk of it until to-morrow, but read this paper to-day." "I will not irritate him," thought Edmund, and taking the paper, of which half was wanting, having been burnt, no doubt, by some accident, he read: "This treasure, which may amount to 2 of Roman crowns in the most distant A of the second opening, declared to belong to him alone, heir, 25th April, 1490. "Well," said Faria, when the young man had finished reading it. "Why," replied Dantès, "I see nothing but broken lines and unconnected words which are rendered illegible by fire." "Yes, to you, my friend, who read them for the first time, but not for me, who have grown pale over them by many nights' study, and have reconstructed every phrase, completed every thought." "And do you believe you have discovered the hidden meaning?" "I am sure I have, and you shall judge for yourself, but first listen to the history of this paper." "Silence!" exclaimed Dantès. "Steps approach. I go. Adieu." And Dantès, happy to escape the history and explanation which would be sure to confirm his belief in his friend's mental instability, glided like a snake along the narrow passage, while Faria, restored by his alarm into a certain amount of activity, pushed the stone into place with his foot and covered it with a mat in order the more effectually to avoid discovery. It was the governor who, hearing of Faria's illness from the jailer, had come in person to see him. Faria sat up to receive him, avoiding all gestures in order that he might conceal from the governor the paralysis that had already half stricken him with death. His fear was lest the governor, touched with pity, might order him to be removed to better quarters and thus separate him from his young companion. But fortunately this was not the case, and the governor left him convinced that the poor madman, for whom in his heart he felt a kind of affection, was only troubled with a slight indisposition. During this time, Edmond, seated on his bed with his head in his hands, tried to collect his scattered thoughts. Faria, since their first acquaintance, had been on all points so rational and logical, so wonderfully sagacious, in fact, that he could not understand how so much wisdom on all points could be allied with madness. Was Faria deceived as to his treasure, or was all the world deceived as to Faria? Dantès remained in his cell all day, not daring to return to his friend, thinking thus to defer the moment when he should be convinced once for all that the abbé was mad. Such a conviction would be so terrible. But towards the evening, after the hour for the customary visit had gone by, Faria, not seeing the young man appear, tried to move and get over the distance which separated them. Edmond shuddered when he heard the painful efforts which the old man made to drag himself along. His leg was inert, and he could no longer make use of one arm. Edmond was obliged to assist him, for otherwise he would not have been able to enter by the small aperture which led to Dantès' chamber. "Here I am, pursuing you remorselessly," he said, with a benignant smile. "You thought to escape my munificence, but it is in vain. Listen to me." Edmond saw there was no escape, and placing the old man on his bed, he seated himself on the stool beside him. "You know," said the abbé, "that I was the secretary and intimate friend of Cardinal Spada, the last of the princes of that name. I owe to this worthy lord all the happiness I ever knew. He was not rich, although the wealth of his family had passed into a proverb, and I heard the phrase very often, as rich as a Spada. But he, like public rumor, lived on this reputation for wealth. His palace was my paradise. I was tutor to his nephews who are dead, and when he was alone in the world, I tried by absolute devotion to his will to make up to him all he had done for me during 10 years of unremitting kindness. The cardinal's house had no secrets for me. I had often seen my noble patron annotating ancient volumes and eagerly searching amongst dusty family manuscripts. One day, when I was reproaching him for his unavailing searches, and deploring the prostration of mind that followed them, he looked at me and, smiling bitterly, opened a volume relating to the history of the city of Rome. There, in the 20th chapter of the life of Pope Alexander VI, were the following lines which I can never forget. The great wars of Romagna had ended. Cesar Borgia, who had completed his conquest, had need of money to purchase all Italy. The Pope had also need of money to bring matters to an end with Louis XII. King of France was formidable, still in spite of his recent reverses, and it was necessary, therefore, to have recourse to some profitable scheme, which was a matter of great difficulty in the impoverished condition of exhausted Italy. His Holiness had an idea. He determined to make 2 cardinals. By choosing 2 of the greatest personages of Rome, especially rich men, this was the return the Holy Father looked for. In the first place, he could sell the great appointments and splendid offices which the cardinals already held, and then he had the 2 hats to sell besides. There was a third point in view, which will appear hereafter. The Pope and Cesar Borgia first found the 2 future cardinals. They were Giovanni Rospigliosi, who held 4 of the highest dignities of the Holy See, and Cesar Spada, one of the noblest and richest of the Roman nobility. Both felt the high honor of such a favor from the Pope. They were ambitious, and Cesar Borgia soon found purchasers for their appointments. The result was that Rospigliosi and Spada paid for being cardinals, and 8 other persons paid for the offices the cardinals held before their elevation, and thus 800,000 crowns entered into the coffers of the speculators. It is time now to proceed to the last part of the speculation. The Pope heaped attentions upon Rospigliosi and Spada, conferred upon them the insignia of the cardinalate, and induced them to arrange their affairs and take up their residence at Rome. Then the Pope and Cesar Borgia invited the 2 cardinals to dinner. This was a matter of dispute between the Holy Father and his son. Cesar thought they could make use of one of the means which he always had ready for his friends. That is to say, in the first place, the famous key which was given to certain persons with the request that they go and open a designated cupboard. This key was furnished with a small iron point, a negligence on the part of the locksmith. When this was pressed to effect the opening of the cupboard, of which the lock was difficult, the person was pricked by this small point and died next day. Then there was the rich king with the lion's head which Cesar wore when he wanted to greet his friends with a clasp of the hand. The lion bit the hand thus favored, and at the end of 24 hours the bite was mortal. Cesar proposed to his father that they should either ask the cardinals to open the cupboard or shake hands with them. But Alexander VI replied, "Now as to the worthy cardinals, Spada and Respigliosi, let us ask both of them to dinner. Something tells me that we shall get that money back. Besides, you forgot, Cesar. An indigestion declares itself immediately, while a prick or a bite occasions a delay of a day or 2. Cesar gave way before such cogent reasoning, and the cardinals were consequently invited to dinner. The table was laid in a vineyard belonging to the Pope, near San Pierdarena, a charming retreat which the cardinals knew very well by report. Rospigliosi, quite set up with his new dignities, went with a good appetite and his most ingratiating manner. Spada, a prudent man and greatly attached to his only nephew, a young captain of the highest promise, took paper and pen and made his will. He then sent word to his nephew to wait for him near the vineyard, but it appeared the servant did not find him. Spada knew what these invitations meant, since Christianity, so eminently civilizing, had made progress in Rome. It was no longer a centurion who came from the tyrant with a message, "Cesar wills that you die," but it was a legate, a latere, who came with a smile on his lips to say from the Pope, His Holiness requests you to dine with him." Spada set out about 2 o'clock to San Pierdarena. The Pope awaited him. The first sight that attracted the eyes of Spada was that of his nephew in full costume, and Cesar Borgia paying him most marked attentions. Spada turned pale, as Cesar looked at him with an ironical air which proved that he had anticipated all, and that the snare was well spread. They began dinner, and Spada was only able to inquire of his nephew if he had received his message. The nephew replied no, perfectly comprehending the meaning of the question. It was too late, for he had already drunk a glass of excellent wine placed for him expressly by the Pope's butler. Spada at the same moment saw another bottle approach him which he was pressed to taste. An hour afterwards a physician declared they were both poisoned through eating mushrooms. Spada died on the threshold of the vineyard. The nephew expired at his own door, making signs which his wife could not comprehend. Then Cesar and the Pope hastened to lay hands on the heritage under presence of seeking for the papers of the dead man. But the inheritance consisted in this only, a scrap of paper on which Spada had written, "I bequeath to my beloved nephew my coffers, my books, and amongst others, my breviary with the gold corners, which I beg he will preserve in remembrance of his affectionate uncle." The heir sought everywhere, admired the breviary, laid hands on the furniture, and were greatly astonished that Spada, the rich man, was really the most miserable of uncles; no treasures, unless they were those of science, contained in the library and laboratories. That was all. Cesar and his father searched, examined, scrutinized, but found nothing, or at least very little, not exceeding a few thousand crowns in plate, and about the same in ready money, but the nephew had time to say to his wife before he expired, "Look well among my uncle's papers, there is a will." They sought even more thoroughly than the august heirs had done, but it was fruitless. There were 2 palaces and a vineyard behind the Palatine Hill, but in these days landed property had not much value, and the 2 palaces and the vineyard remained to the family, since they were beneath the rapacity of the Pope and his son. Months and years rolled on. Alexander VI died, poisoned, you know by what mistake. Cesar, poisoned at the same time, escaped by shedding his skin like a snake, but the new skin was spotted by the poison till it looked like a tiger's. Then, compelled to quit Rome, he went and got himself obscurely killed in a night skirmish, scarcely noticed in history. After the Pope's death and his son's exile, it was supposed that the Spada family would resume the splendid position they had held before the Cardinal's time, but this was not the case. The Spadas remained in doubtful ease, a mystery hung over this dark affair, and the public rumour was that Cesar, a better politician than his father, had carried off from the Pope the fortune of the 2 cardinals. I say the 2, because Cardinal Rospigliosi, who had not taken any precaution, was completely despoiled. "Up to this," said Faria, interrupting the thread of his narrative, "this seems to you very meaningless, no doubt, eh?" "Oh, my friend," cried Dantes, "on the contrary, it seems as if I were reading a most interesting narrative. Go on, I beg of you." "I will. The family began to get accustomed to their obscurity. Years rolled on, and amongst the descendants some were soldiers, others diplomatists, some churchmen, some bankers, some grew rich, and some were ruined. I come now to the last of the family whose secretary I was, the Count of Spada. I had often heard him complain of the disproportion of his rank with his fortune, and I advised him to invest all he had in an annuity. He did so, and thus doubled his income. The celebrated breviary remained in the family, and was in the Count's possession. It had been handed down from father to son, for the singular clause of the only will that had been found had caused it to be regarded as a genuine relic, preserved in the family with superstitious veneration. It was an illuminated book, with beautiful Gothic characters, and so weighty with gold, that a servant always carried it before the cardinal on days of great solemnity. At the sight of papers of all sorts, titles, contracts, parchments, which were kept in the archives of the family, all descending from the poisoned cardinal, I in my turn examined the immense bundles of documents, like 20 servitors, stewards, secretaries before me, but in spite of the most exhaustive researches I found nothing. Yet I had even written a precise history of the Borgia family, for the sole purpose of assuring myself whether any increase of fortune had occurred to them on the death of the Cardinal Cesar Spada, but could only trace the acquisition of the property of the Cardinal Rospigliosi, his companion in misfortune. I was then almost assured that the inheritance had neither profited the Borgias nor the family, but had remained unpossessed, like the treasures of the Arabian Nights, which slept in the bosom of the earth under the eyes of the genii. I searched, ransacked, counted, calculated 1,000 and 1,000 times the income and expenditure of the family for 300 years. It was useless. I remained in my ignorance, and the Count of Spada in his poverty. My patron died. He had reserved from his annuity his family papers, his library, composed of 5,000 volumes, and his famous breviary. All these he bequeathed to me, with 1,000 Roman crowns, which he had in ready money, on condition that I would have anniversary masses said for the repose of his soul, and that I would draw up a genealogical tree and history of his house. All this I did scrupulously. Be easy, my dear Edmond. We are near the conclusion. In 1807, a month before I was arrested, and a fortnight after the death of the Count of Spada, on the 25th of December, you will see presently how the date became fixed in my memory. I was reading for the 1,000th time the papers I was arranging, for the palace was sold to a stranger, and I was going to leave Rome and settle at Florence, intending to take with me 12,000 francs I possessed, my library, and the famous breviary, when, tired with my constant labour at the same thing, and overcome by a heavy dinner I had eaten, my head dropped on my hands, and I fell asleep about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I awoke as the clock was striking 6. I raised my head. I was in utter darkness. I rang for a light, but as no one came, I determined to find one for myself. It was indeed but anticipating the simple manners which I should soon be under the necessity of adopting. I took a wax candle in one hand, and with the other groped about for a piece of paper, my matchbox being empty, with which I proposed to get a light from the small flame still playing on the embers. Fearing, however, to make use of any valuable piece of paper, I hesitated for a moment, then recollected that I had seen in the famous breviary, which was on the table beside me, an old paper quite yellow with age, and which had served as a marker for centuries, kept there by the request of the heirs. I felt for it, found it, twisted it up together, and putting it on to the expiring flame, set light to it. But beneath my fingers, as if by magic, in proportion as the fire ascended, I saw yellowish characters appear on the paper. I grasped it in my hand, put out the flame as quickly as I could, lighted my taper in the fire itself, and opened the crumpled paper with inexpressible emotion, recognizing when I had done so that these characters had been traced in mysterious and sympathetic ink, only appearing when exposed to the fire. Nearly 1/3 of the paper had been consumed by the flame. It was that paper you read this morning. Read it again, Dantès, and then I will complete for you the incomplete words and unconnected sense. Faria, with an air of triumph, offered the paper to Dantès, who this time read the following words, traced with an ink of a reddish color resembling rust. This 25th day of April, 1498, B. Alexander the Sixth, and fearing that not, he may desire to become my heir, and and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned, my sole heir that I have bew, and has visited with me that is in island of Monte Cristo all I possess, jewels, diamonds, gems that I alone may amount to nearly 2 mil, will find on raising the 20th row, creek to the east in a right line, to open. In these caves, the treasure is in the furthest A, which treasure I bequeath and leave N, as my sole heir, 25th April, 1498, says. And now, said the Abbé, read this other paper. And he presented to Dantès a second leaf with fragments of lines written on it, which Edmund read as follows. Ing invited to dine by his holiness, content with making me pay for my hat, serves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprara, I declare to my nephew Guido Spada, read in a place he knows, The caves of the small est of ingots, gold, money? Know of the existence of this treasure, which lions of Roman crowns, and which he, ick from the small, ings have been made, Engel in the second, tire to him, our spada. Faria followed him with an excited look. And now, he said, when he saw that Dantes had read the last line, put the two fragments together and judge for yourself. Dantes obeyed, and the conjointed pieces gave the following. This 25th day of April, 1498, being invited to dine by His Holiness Alexander VI, and fearing that not content with making me pay for my hat, he may desire to become my heir, and reserves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprara and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned, I declare to my nephew Guido Spada, my sole heir, that I have buried in a place he knows and has visited with me, that is, in the caves of the small island of Monte Cristo, all I possessed of ingots, gold, money, jewels, diamonds, gems, that I alone know of the existence of this treasure, which may amount to nearly 2 millions of Roman crowns, and which he will find on raising the 20th rock from the small creek to the east in a right line. 2 openings have been made in these caves. The treasure is in the furthest angle in the second, which treasure I bequeath and leave entire to him as my sole heir. 25th April, 1498. Cesar Spada. Well, do you comprehend now? Inquired Faria. It is the declaration of Cardinal Spada, and the will so long sought for, replied Edmond, still incredulous. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. And who completed it as it now is? I did. Aided by the remaining fragment, I guessed the rest, measuring the length of the lines by those of the paper, and divining the hidden meaning by means of what was in part revealed, as we are guided in a cavern, by the small ray of light above us. And what did you do when you arrived at this conclusion? I resolved to set out, and did set out at that very instant, carrying with me the beginning of my great work, the unity of the Italian kingdom. But for some time the imperial police, who at this period, quite contrary to what Napoleon desired so soon as he had a son born to him, wished for a partition of provinces, had their eyes on me and my hasty departure, the cause of which they were unable to guess, having aroused their suspicions. I was arrested at the very moment I was leaving Piombino. Now, continued Faria, addressing Dantes with an almost paternal expression, now, my dear fellow, you know as much as I do myself. If we ever escape together, half this treasure is yours. If I die here and you escape alone, the whole belongs to you. But, inquired Dantes, hesitating, has this treasure no more legitimate possessor in the world than ourselves? No, no, be easy on that score. The family is extinct. The last Count of Spada, moreover, made me his heir, bequeathing to me this symbolic breviary. He bequeathed to me all it contained. No, no, make your mind satisfied on that point. If we lay hands on this fortune, we may enjoy it without remorse. And you say this treasure amounts to 2 millions of Roman crowns, nearly 13 millions of our money, 2,600,000 in 1894. Impossible, said Dantes, staggered at the enormous amount. Impossible? And why? Asked the old man. The Spada family was one of the oldest and most powerful families of the 15th century, and in those times, when other opportunities for investment were wanting, such accumulations of gold and jewels were by no means rare. There are at this day Roman families perishing of hunger, though possessed of nearly 1 million in diamonds and jewels handed down by entail, and which they cannot touch. Edmund thought he was in a dream. He wavered between incredulity and joy. I have only kept this secret so long from you, continued Faria, that I might test your character, and then surprise you. Had we escaped before my attack of catalepsy, I should have conducted you to Monte Cristo. Now, he added with a sigh, it is you who will conduct me thither. Well, Dantes, you do not thank me? This treasure belongs to you, my dear friend, replied Dantes, and to you only. I have no right to it. I am no relation of yours. You are my son, Dantes, exclaimed the old man. You are the child of my captivity. My profession condemns me to celibacy. God has sent you to me to console, at one and the same time, the man who could not be a father, and the prisoner who could not get free. And Faria extended the arm, of which alone the use remained to him, to the young man who threw himself upon his neck and wept. End of chapter 18. The Treasure.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 19. The Third Attack. Now that this treasure, which had so long been the object of the Abbé's meditations, could ensure the future happiness of him whom Faria really loved as a son, it had doubled its value in his eyes, and every day he expatiated on the amount, explaining to Dantes all the good which, with 13 or 14 millions of francs, a man could do in these days to his friends. And then Dantes' countenance became gloomy, for the oath of vengeance he had taken recurred to his memory, and he reflected how much ill in these times a man with 13 or 14 millions could do to his enemies. The Abbé did not know the island of Monte Cristo, but Dantes knew it, and had often passed it, situated 25 miles from Pianosa, between Corsica and the island of Elba, and had once touched there. This island was, always had been, and still is, completely deserted. It is a rock of almost conical form, which looks as though it had been thrust up by volcanic force from the depth to the surface of the ocean. Dantes drew a plan of the island for Faria, and Faria gave Dantes advice as to the means he should employ to recover the treasure. But Dantes was far from being as enthusiastic and confident as the old man. It was past a question now that Faria was not a lunatic, and the way in which he had achieved the discovery, which had given rise to the suspicion of his madness, increased Edmond's admiration of him. But at the same time, Dantes could not believe that the deposit, supposing it had ever existed, still existed, and though he considered the treasure as by no means chimerical, he yet believed it was no longer there. However, as if fate resolved on depriving the prisoners of their last chance, and making them understand that they were condemned to perpetual imprisonment, a new misfortune befell them. The gallery on the sea-side, which had long been in ruins, was rebuilt. They had repaired it completely, and stopped up with vast masses of stone the hole Dantes had partly filled in. But for this precaution, which it will be remembered the Abbé had made to Edmond, the misfortune would have been still greater, for their attempt to escape would have been detected, and they would undoubtedly have been separated. Thus a new, a stronger, and more inexorable barrier was interposed to cut off the realization of their hopes. "You see," said the young man, with an air of sorrowful resignation to Faria, "that God deems it right to take from me any claim to merit for what you call my devotion to you. I have promised to remain forever with you, and now I could not break my promise if I would. The treasure will be no more mine than yours, and neither of us will quit this prison. But my real treasure is not that, my dear friend, which awaits me beneath the sombre rocks of Monte Cristo. It is your presence, our living together 5 or 6 hours a day, in spite of our jailers. It is the rays of intelligence you have elicited from my brain, the languages you have implanted in my memory, and which have taken root there with all their philological ramifications. These different sciences that you have made so easy to me by the depth of the knowledge you possess of them, and the clearness of the principles to which you have reduced them. This is my treasure, my beloved friend, and with this you have made me rich and happy. Believe me, and take comfort. This is better for me than tons of gold and cases of diamonds, even were they not as problematical as the clouds we see in the morning floating over the sea, which we take for terra firma, and which evaporate and vanish as we draw near to them. To have you as long as possible near me, to hear your eloquent speech, which embellishes my mind, strengthens my soul, and makes my whole frame capable of great and terrible things. If I should ever be free, so fills my whole existence that the despair to which I was just on the point of yielding when I knew you has no longer any hold over me. And this my fortune, not chimerical but actual, I owe you my real good, my present happiness, and all the sovereigns of the earth, even Caesar Borgia himself, could not deprive me of this. Thus, if not actually happy, yet the days these two unfortunates passed together went quickly. Faria, who for so long a time had kept silence as to the treasure, now perpetually talked of it. As he had prophesied would be the case, he remained paralyzed in the right arm and the left leg, and had given up all hope of ever enjoying it himself. But he was continually thinking over some means of escape for his young companion, and anticipating the pleasure he would enjoy. For fear the letter might be some day lost or stolen, he compelled Dantes to learn it by heart, and Dantes knew it, from the first to the last word. Then he destroyed the second portion, assured that if the first were seized, no one would be able to discover its real meaning. Whole hours sometimes passed while Faria was giving instructions to Dantes, instructions which were to serve him when he was at liberty. Then, once free, from the day and hour and moment he was so, he could have but one only thought, which was to gain Monte Cristo by some means, and remain there alone under some pretext which would arouse no suspicions, and once there, to endeavor to find the wonderful caverns, and search in the appointed spot, be it remembered, being the farthest angle in the second opening. In the meanwhile, the hours passed, if not rapidly, at least tolerably. Faria, as we have said, without having recovered the use of his hand and foot, had regained all the clearness of his understanding, and had gradually, besides the moral instructions we have detailed, taught his youthful companion the patient and sublime duty of a prisoner, who learns to make something from nothing. They were thus perpetually employed, Faria, that he might not see himself grow old, Dantes, for fear of recalling the almost extinct past which now only floated in his memory like a distant light wandering in the night. So life went on for them as it does for those who are not victims of misfortune, and whose activities glide along mechanically and tranquilly beneath the eye of Providence. But beneath this superficial calm, there were in the heart of the young man, and perhaps in that of the old man, many repressed desires, many stifled sighs, which found vent when Faria was left alone, and when Edmond returned to his cell. One night, Edmond awoke suddenly, believing that he heard some one calling him. He opened his eyes upon utter darkness. His name, or rather a plaintive voice, which essayed to pronounce his name, reached him. He sat up in bed, and a cold sweat broke out upon his brow. Undoubtedly the call came from Faria's dungeon. "Alas," murmured Edmond, "can it be?" He moved his bed, drew up the stone, rushed into the passage, and reached the opposite extremity. The secret entrance was open. By the light of the wretched and wavering lamp, of which we have spoken, Dantes saw the old man, pale, but yet erect, clinging to the bedstead. His features were writhing with those horrible symptoms which he already knew, and which had so seriously alarmed him when he saw them for the first time. "Alas, my dear friend," said Faria in a resigned tone, "you understand, do you not? And I need not attempt to explain to you." Edmond uttered a cry of agony, and quite out of his senses rushed towards the door, exclaiming, "Help! Help!" Faria had just sufficient strength to restrain him. "Silence," he said, "or you are lost. We must now only think of you, my dear friend, and so act as to render your captivity supportable, or your flight possible. It would require years to do again what I have done here, and the results would be instantly destroyed if our jailers knew we had communicated with each other. Besides, be assured, my dear Edmond, the dungeon I am about to leave will not long remain empty. Some other unfortunate being will soon take my place, and to him you will appear like an angel of salvation. Perhaps he will be young, strong, and enduring like yourself, and will aid you in your escape, while I have been but a hindrance. You will no longer have half a dead body tied to you as a drag to all your movements. At length Providence has done something for you. He restores to you more than he takes away, and it was time I should die." Edmond could only clasp his hands and exclaim, "Oh, my friend, speak not thus!" And then, resuming all his presence of mind, which had for a moment staggered under this blow, and his strength, which had failed at the words of the old man, he said, "Oh, I have saved you once, and I will save you a second time." And raising the foot of the bed, he drew out the phial, still a third filled with the red liquor. "See!" he exclaimed, "there remains still some of the magic draught. Quick, quick! Tell me what I must do this time. Are there fresh instructions? Speak, my friend, I listen." "There is not a hope," replied Faria, shaking his head. "But no matter. God wills it that man whom he has created, and in whose heart he has so profoundly rooted the love of life, should do all in his power to preserve that existence, which, however painful it may be, is yet always so dear." "Oh, yes, yes!" exclaimed Dantès, "and I tell you that I will save you yet." "Well, then, try. The cold gains upon me. I feel the blood flowing towards my brain. These horrible chills, which make my teeth chatter and seem to dislocate my bones, begin to pervade my whole frame. In 5 minutes the malady will reach its height, and in a quarter of an hour there will be nothing left of me but a corpse." "Oh!" exclaimed Dantès, his heart wrung with anguish. "Do as you did before, only do not wait so long. All the springs of life are now exhausted in me. And death," he continued, looking at his paralyzed arm and leg, "has but half its work to do. If, after having made me swallow 12 drops instead of 10, you see that I do not recover, then pour the rest down my throat. Now, lift me on my bed, for I can no longer support myself." Edmond took the old man in his arms and laid him on the bed. "And now, my dear friend," said Faria, "sole consolation of my wretched existence, you whom heaven gave me somewhat late, but still gave me, a priceless gift, and for which I am most grateful. At the moment of separating from you forever, I wish you all the happiness and all the prosperity you so well deserve. My son, I bless thee." The young man cast himself on his knees, leaning his head against the old man's bed. "Listen now to what I say in this my dying moment. The treasure of the Spadas exists. God grants me the boon of vision unrestricted by time or space. I see it in the depths of the inner cavern. My eyes pierce the inmost recesses of the earth and are dazzled at the sight of so much riches. If you do escape, remember that the poor abbé, whom all the world called mad, was not so. Hasten to Monte Cristo. Avail yourself of the fortune, for you have indeed suffered long enough." A violent convulsion attacked the old man. Dantès raised his head and saw Faria's eyes injected with blood. It seemed as if a flow of blood had ascended from the chest to the head. "Adieu, adieu," murmured the old man, clasping Edmond's hand convulsively. "Adieu!" "Oh, no, no, not yet!" he cried. "Do not forsake me! Oh, succor him! Help! Help! Help!" "Hush! Hush!" murmured the dying man. "That they may not separate us if you save me." "You are right. Oh, yes, yes, be assured I shall save you. Besides, although you suffer much, you do not seem to be in such agony as you were before." "Do not mistake. I suffer less, because there is in me less strength to endure. At your age, we have faith in life. It is the privilege of youth to believe and hope, but old men see death more clearly. Oh, 'tis here, 'tis here, 'tis over, my sight is gone, my senses fail. Your hand, Dantès! Adieu, adieu!" And raising himself by a final effort, in which he summoned all of his faculties, he said, "Monte Cristo! Forget not Monte Cristo!" and fell back on the bed. The crisis was terrible, and a rigid form with twisted limbs, swollen eyelids, and lips flecked with bloody foam lay on the bed of torture, in place of the intellectual being who so lately rested there. Dantès took the lamp, placed it on a projecting stone above the bed, whence its tremulous light fell with strange and fantastic ray on the distorted countenance and motionless, stiffened body. With steady gaze he awaited confidently the moment for administering the restorative. When he believed that the right moment had arrived, he took the knife, pried open the teeth, which offered less resistance than before, counted one after the other 12 drops, and watched. The phial contained perhaps twice as much more. He waited 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, half an hour. No change took place. Trembling, his hair erect, his brow bathed with perspiration, he counted the seconds by the beating of his heart. Then he thought it was time to make the last trial, and he put the phial to the purple lips of Faria, and without having occasion to force open his jaws, which had remained extended, he poured the whole of the liquid down his throat. The draught produced a galvanic effect. A violent trembling pervaded the old man's limbs. His eyes opened until it was fearful to gaze upon them. He heaved a sigh which resembled a shriek, and then his convulsed body returned gradually to its former immobility, the eyes remaining open. Half an hour and a half elapsed, and during this period of anguish Edmond leaned over his friend, his hand applied to his heart, and felt the body gradually grow cold, and the heart's pulsation become more and more deep and dull, until at length it stopped. The last movement of the heart ceased. The face became livid. The eyes remained open, but the eyeballs were glazed. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The dawn was just breaking, and its feeble ray came into the dungeon and paled the ineffectual light of the lamp. Strange shadows passed over the countenance of the dead man, and at times gave it the appearance of life. While the struggle between day and night lasted, Dantès still doubted, but as soon as the daylight gained the preeminence, he saw that he was alone with the corpse. Then an invincible and extreme terror seized upon him, and he dared not again press the hand that hung out of bed. He dared no longer to gaze on those fixed and vacant eyes, which he tried many times to close, but in vain. They opened again as soon as shut. He extinguished the lamp, carefully concealed it, and then went away, closing as well as he could the entrance to the secret passage by the large stone as he descended. It was time, for the jailer was coming. On this occasion he began his rounds at Dantès' cell, and on leaving him he went on to Faria's dungeon, taking thither breakfast and some linen. Nothing betokened that the man knew anything of what had occurred. He went on his way. Dantès was then seized with an indescribable desire to know what was going on in the dungeon of his unfortunate friend. He therefore returned by the subterraneous gallery, and arrived in time to hear the exclamations of the turnkey, who called out for help. Other turnkeys came, and then was heard the regular tramp of soldiers. Last of all came the governor. Edmond heard the creaking of the bed as they moved the corpse, heard the voice of the governor, who asked them to throw water on the dead man's face, and seeing that, in spite of this application, the prisoner did not recover, they sent for the doctor. The governor then went out, and words of pity fell on Dantès' listening ears, mingled with brutal laughter. "Well, well," said the one, "the madman has gone to look after his treasure. Good journey to him. With all his millions, he will not have enough to pay for his shroud," said another. "Oh," added a third voice, "the shrouds of Chateau d'If are not dear." "Perhaps," said one of the previous speakers, "as he was a churchman, they may go to some expense on his behalf. They may give him the honors of the sack." Edmund did not lose a word, but comprehended very little of what was said. The voices soon ceased, and it seemed to him as if every one had left the cell. Still, he dared not to enter, as they might have left some turnkey to watch the dead. He remained, therefore, mute and motionless, hardly venturing to breathe. At the end of an hour he heard a faint noise, which increased. It was the governor who returned, followed by the doctor and other attendants. There was a moment's silence. It was evident that the doctor was examining the dead body. The inquiries soon commenced. The doctor analyzed the symptoms of the malady to which the prisoner had succumbed, and declared that he was dead. Questions and answers followed in a nonchalant manner that made Dantès indignant, for he felt that all the world should have for the poor abbé a love and respect equal to his own. "I am very sorry for what you tell me," said the governor, replying to the assurance of the doctor, "that the old man is really dead, for he was a quiet, inoffensive prisoner, happy in his folly, and required no watching." "Ah," added the turnkey, "there was no occasion for watching him. He would have stayed here 50 years, I'll answer for it, without any attempt to escape." "Still," said the governor, "I believe it would be requisite, notwithstanding your certainty, and not that I doubt your science, but in discharge of my official duty, that we should be perfectly assured that the prisoner is dead." There was a moment of complete silence, during which Dantès, still listening, knew that the doctor was examining the corpse a second time. "You may make your mind easy," said the doctor. He is dead. I will answer for that. You know, sir, said the governor, persisting, that we are not content in such cases as this with such a simple examination. In spite of all appearances, be so kind, therefore, as to finish your duty by fulfilling the formalities described by law. Let the irons be heated, said the doctor, but really it is a useless precaution. This order to heat the irons made Dantès shudder. He heard hasty steps, the creaking of a door, people going and coming, and some minutes afterwards he entered, saying, Here's a brazier, lighted. There was a moment's silence, and then was heard the crackling of burning flesh, of which the peculiar and nauseous smell penetrated even behind the wall where Dantès was listening in horror. The perspiration poured forth upon the young man's brow, and he felt as if he should faint. You see, sir, he really is dead, said the doctor. This burn in the heel is decisive. The poor fool is cured of his folly, and delivered from his captivity. Wasn't his name Faria? Inquired one of the officers who accompanied the governor. Yes, sir, and as he said, it was an ancient name. He was, too, very learned, and rational enough on all points which did not relate to his treasure, but on that, indeed, he was intractable. It is a sort of malady which we call monomania, said the doctor. You never had anything to complain of, said the governor to the jailer who had charge of the abbé. Never, sir, replied the jailer. Never. On the contrary, he sometimes amused me very much by telling me stories. One day, too, when my wife was ill, he gave me a prescription which cured her. Ah, said the doctor. I did not know that I had a rival. But I hope, governor, that you will show him all proper respect. Yes, make your mind easy. He shall be decently interred in the newest sack we can find. Will that satisfy you? Must this last formality take place in your presence, sir? Inquired a turnkey. Certainly, but make haste. I cannot stay here all day. Other footsteps, going and coming, were now heard, and a moment afterwards the noise of rustling canvas reached Dantès' ears. The bed creaked, and the heavy footfall of a man who lifts a weight sounded on the floor. Then the bed again creaked under the weight deposited upon it. This evening, said the governor. Will there be any mass? Asked one of the attendants. That is impossible, replied the governor. The chaplain of the chateau came to me yesterday to beg for leave of absence, in order to take a trip to Jerez for a week. I told him I would attend to the prisoners in his absence. If the poor abbé had not been in such a hurry, he might have had his requiem. Pooh, said the doctor, with the impiety usual in persons of his profession. He is a churchman. God will respect his profession, and not give the devil the wicked delight of sending him to a priest. A shout of laughter followed this brutal jest. Meanwhile, the operation of putting the body in the sack was going on. This evening, said the governor, when the task was ended. At what hour? Inquired the turnkey. Why, about 10 or 11 o'clock. Shall we watch by the corpse? Of what use would it be? Shut the dungeon as if he were alive, that is all. Then the steps retreated, and the voices died away in the distance. The noise of the door, with its creaking hinges and bolts, ceased, and a silence more sombre than that of solitude ensued, the silence of death, which was all-pervasive and struck its icy chill to the very soul of Dantès. Then he raised the flagstone cautiously with his head, and looked carefully around the chamber. It was empty, and Dantès emerged from the tunnel. End of chapter 19.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Luoma, greenkri.com. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 20. The Cemetery of Château d'If. On the bed, at full length and faintly illuminated by the pale light that came from the window, lay a sack of canvas, and under its rude folds was stretched a long and stiffened form. It was Faria's last winding sheet, a winding sheet which, as the turnkey said, cost so little. Everything was in readiness. A barrier had been placed between Dantes and his old friend. No longer could Edmund look into those wide-opened eyes which had seemed to be penetrating the mysteries of death. No longer could he clasp the hand which had done so much to make his existence blessed. Faria, the beneficent and cheerful companion, with whom he was accustomed to live so intimately, no longer breathed. He seated himself on the edge of that terrible bed, and fell into melancholy and gloomy reverie. Alone. He was alone again, again condemned to silence, again face to face with nothingness. Alone. Never again to see the face, never again to hear the voice of the only human being who united him to earth. Was not Faria's fate the better, after all, to solve the problem of life at its source, even at the risk of horrible suffering? The idea of suicide, which his friend had driven away and kept away by his cheerful presence, now hovered like a phantom over the abbé's dead body. "If I could die," he said, "I should go where he goes, and should assuredly find him again. But how to die? It is very easy," he went on with a smile. "I will remain here, rush on the first person that opens the door, strangle him, and then they will guillotine me." But excessive grief is like a storm at sea, where the frail bark is tossed from the depths to the top of the wave. Dantes recoiled from the idea of so infamous a death, and passed suddenly from despair to an ardent desire for life and liberty. "Die? Oh no!" he exclaimed. "Not die now, after having lived and suffered so long and so much. Die? Yes, had I died years ago. But now to die would be, indeed, to give way to the sarcasm of destiny. No, I want to live. I shall struggle to the very last. I will yet win back the happiness of which I have been deprived. Before I die, I must not forget that I have my executioners to punish, and perhaps, too, who knows, some friends to reward. Yet they will forget me here, and I shall die in my dungeon like Faria." As he said this, he became silent, and gazed straight before him like one overwhelmed with a strange and amazing thought. Suddenly he arose, lifted his hand to his brow as if his brain were giddy, paced twice or thrice round the dungeon, and then paused abruptly by the bed. "Just God!" he muttered. "Whence comes this thought? Is it from thee? Since none but the dead pass freely from this dungeon, let me take the place of the dead." Without giving himself time to reconsider his decision, and indeed that he might not allow his thoughts to be distracted from his desperate resolution, he bent over the appalling shroud, opened it with the knife which Faria had made, drew the corpse from the sack, and bore it along the tunnel to his own chamber, laid it on his couch, tied around its head the rag he wore at night around his own, covered it with his counterpane, once again kissed the ice-cold brow, and tried vainly to close the resisting eyes, which glared horribly, turned the head towards the wall so that the jailer might, when he brought the evening meal, believe that he was asleep, as was his frequent custom. Entered the tunnel again, drew the bed against the wall, returned to the other cell, took from the hiding-place the needle and thread, flung off his rags that they might feel only naked flesh beneath the coarse canvas, and, getting inside the sack, placed himself in the posture in which the dead body had been laid, and sewed up the mouth of the sack from the inside. He would have been discovered by the beating of his heart, if by any mischance the jailers had entered at that moment. Dantes might have waited until the evening visit was over, but he was afraid that the governor would change his mind, and order the dead body to be removed earlier. In that case, his last hope would have been destroyed. Now his plans were fully made, and this is what he intended to do. If, while he was being carried out, the gravediggers should discover that they were bearing a live instead of a dead body, Dantes did not intend to give them time to recognize him, but with a sudden cut of the knife, he meant to open the sack from top to bottom, and, profiting by their alarm, escape. if they tried to catch him, he would use his knife to better purpose. If they took him to the cemetery and laid him in a grave, he would allow himself to be covered with earth, and then, as it was night, the gravediggers could scarcely have turned their backs before he would have worked his way through the yielding soil and escaped. He hoped that the weight of the earth would not be so great that he could not overcome it. If he was detected in this and the earth proved too heavy, he would be stifled, and then, so much the better, all would be over. Dantès had not eaten since the preceding evening, but he had not thought of hunger, nor did he think of it now. His situation was too precarious to allow him even time to reflect on any thought but one. The first risk that Dantès ran was that the jailer, when he brought him his supper at 7 o'clock, might perceive the change that had been made. Fortunately, 20 times at least, from misanthropy or fatigue, Dantès had received his jailer in bed, and then the man placed his bread and soup on the table, and went away without saying a word. This time, the jailer might not be as silent as usual, but speak to Dantès, and seeing that he received no reply, go to the bed, and thus discover all. When 7 o'clock came, Dantès' agony really began. His hand, placed upon his heart, was unable to redress its throbbings, while with the other he wiped the perspiration from his temples. From time to time, chills ran through his whole body and clutched his heart in a grasp of ice. Then he thought he was going to die. Yet the hours passed on without any unusual disturbance, and Dantès knew that he had escaped the first peril. It was a good augury. At length, about the hour the governor had appointed, footsteps were heard on the stairs. Edmund felt that the moment had arrived, summoned up all his courage, held his breath, and would have been happy if at the same time he could have repressed the throbbing in his veins. The footsteps, they were double, paused at the door, and Dantès guessed that the 2 gravediggers had come to seek him. This idea was soon converted into certainty when he heard the noise they made in putting down the hand-bier. The door opened, and a dim light reached Dantès' eyes through the coarse sack that covered him. He saw 2 shadows approach his bed, a third remaining at the door with a torch in its hand. The 2 men, approaching the ends of the bed, took the sack by its extremities. "He's heavy, though, for an old man," said one as he raised the head. "They say every year adds half a pound to the weight of bones," added another, lifting the feet. "Have you tied the knot?" inquired the first speaker. "What would be the use of carrying so much more weight?" was the reply. "I can do that when we get there." "Yes, you're right," replied the companion. "What's the knot for?" thought Dantès. They deposited the supposed corpse on the bier. Edmund stiffened himself in order to play the part of a dead man, and then the party, lighted by the man with the torch who went first, ascended the stairs. Suddenly he felt the fresh and sharp night air, and Dantès knew that the mistral was blowing. It was a sensation in which pleasure and pain were strangely mingled. The bearers went on for 20 paces, then stopped, putting the bier down on the ground. One of them went away, and Dantès heard his shoes striking on the pavement. "Where am I?" he asked himself. "Really, he is by no means a light load," said the other bearer, sitting on the edge of the hand-barrow. Dantès' first impulse was to escape, but fortunately he did not attempt it. "Give us a light," said the other bearer, "or I shall never find what I am looking for." The man with the torch complied, although not asked in the most polite terms. "What can he be looking for?" thought Edmund. "The spade, perhaps." An exclamation of satisfaction indicated that the gravedigger had found the object of his search. "Here it is at last," he said, "not without some trouble, though." "Yes," was the answer, "but it has lost nothing by waiting." As he said this, the man came towards Edmund, who heard a heavy metallic substance laid down beside him, and at the same moment a cord was fastened round his feet with sudden and painful violence. "Well, have you tied the knot?" inquired the gravedigger, who was looking on. "Yes, and pretty tight too, I can tell you," was the answer. "Move on, then." And the bier was lifted once more, and they proceeded. They advanced 50 paces farther, and then stopped to open a door, then went forward again. The noise of the waves dashing against the rocks on which the chateau was built reached Dantès' ear distinctly as they went forward. "Bad weather," observed one of the bearers. "Not a pleasant night for a dip in the sea." "Why, yes, the abbey runs a chance of being wet," said the other. And then there was a burst of brutal laughter. Dantès did not comprehend the jest, but his hair stood erect on his head. "Well, here we are at last," said one of them. A little farther," said the other. "You know very well that the last was stopped on his way, dashed on the rocks, and the governor told us next day that we were careless fellows." They ascended 5 or 6 more steps, and then Dantès felt that they took him, one by the head and the other by the heels, and swung him to and fro. "1," said the gravers, "2, 3." At the same instant, Dantès felt himself flung into the air like a wounded bird, falling with a rapidity that made his blood curdle. Although drawn downwards by the heavy weight which hastened his rapid descent, it seemed to him as if the fall lasted for a century. At last, with a horrible splash, he darted like an arrow into the ice-cold water, and as he did so he uttered a shrill cry, stifled in a moment by his immersion beneath the waves. Dantès had been flung into the sea and was dragged to its depths by a 36-pound shot tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of the Château d'If. End of chapter 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne. greenkri.com. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 21. The Island of Tiboulin. Dantès, although stunned and almost suffocated, had sufficient presence of mind to hold his breath, and as his right hand, prepared as he was for every chance, held his knife open, he rapidly ripped up the sack, extricated his arm, and then his body. But in spite of all his efforts to free himself from the shot, he felt it dragging him down, still lower. He then bent his body, and by a desperate effort severed the cord that bound his legs, at the moment when it seemed as if he were actually strangled. With a mighty leap, he rose to the surface of the sea, while the shot dragged down to the depths the sack that had so nearly become his shroud. Dantès waited only to get breath, and then dived in order to avoid being seen. When he arose a second time, he was 50 paces from where he had first sunk. He saw overhead a black and tempestuous sky, across which the wind was driving clouds that occasionally suffered a twinkling star to appear. Before him was the vast expanse of waters, somber and terrible, whose waves foamed and roared as if before the approach of a storm. Behind him, blacker than the sea, blacker than the sky, rose, phantom-like, the vast stone structure, whose projecting crags seemed like arms extended to seize their prey, and on the highest rock was a torch lighting 2 figures. He fancied that these 2 forms were looking at the sea. Doubtless these strange grave-diggers had heard his cry. Dantès dived again, and remained a long time beneath the water. This was an easy feat to him, for he usually attracted a crowd of spectators in the bay before the lighthouse at Marseille when he swam there, and was unanimously declared to be the best swimmer in the port. When he came up again, the light had disappeared. He must now get his bearings. Ratonneau and Pomègue are the nearest islands of all those that surround the Château d'If, but Ratonneau and Pomègue are inhabited, as is also the islet of Daume. Tiboulin and Le Maire were therefore the safest for Dantès' adventure. The island of Tiboulin and Le Maire are a league from the Château d'If. Dantès, nevertheless, determined to make for them. But how could he find his way in the darkness of the night? At this moment he saw the light of Planier, gleaming in front of him like a star. By leaving this light on the right, he kept the island of Tiboulin a little on the left. By turning to the left, therefore, he would find it. But, as we have said, it was at least a league from the Chateau d'If to this island. Often in prison, Faria had said to him, when he saw him idle and inactive, "Dantès, you must not give way to this listlessness. You will be drowned if you seek to escape, and your strength has not been properly exercised and prepared for exertion." These words rang in Dantès' ears, even beneath the waves. He hastened to cleave his way through them, to see if he had not lost his strength. He found with pleasure that his captivity had taken away nothing of his power, and he was still master of that element on whose bosom he had so often sported as a boy. Fear, that relentless pursuer, clogged Dantès' efforts. He listened for any sound that might be audible, and every time that he rose to the top of a wave, he scanned the horizon, and strove to penetrate the darkness. He fancied that every wave behind him was a pursuing boat, and he redoubled his exertions, increasing rapidly his distance from the chateau, but exhausting his strength. He swam on still, and already the terrible chateau had disappeared in the darkness. He could not see it, but he felt its presence. An hour passed, during which Dantès, excited by the feeling of freedom, continued to cleave the waves. "Let us see," said he. "I have swum about an hour, but as the wind is against me, that has retarded my speed. However, if I am not mistaken, I must be close to Tiboulin. But what if I were mistaken?" A shudder passed over him. He sought to tread water in order to rest himself, but the sea was too violent, and he felt that he could not make use of this means of recuperation. "Well," said he, "I will swim on until I am worn out or the cramp seizes me, and then I shall sink." And he struck out with energy or despair. Suddenly the sky seemed to him to become still darker and more dense, and heavy clouds seemed to sweep down towards him. At the same time he felt a sharp pain in his knee. He fancied for a moment that he had been shot, and listened for the report, but he heard nothing. Then he put out his hand and encountered an obstacle, and with another stroke knew that he had gained the shore. Before him rose a grotesque mass of rocks that resembled nothing so much as a vast fire petrified at the moment of its most fervent combustion. It was the island of Tiboulin. Dantès rose, advanced a few steps, and with a fervent prayer of gratitude stretched himself on the granite, which seemed to him softer than down. Then, in spite of the wind and rain, he fell into the deep, sweet sleep of utter exhaustion. At the expiration of an hour, Edmond was awakened by the roar of thunder. The tempest was let loose and beating the atmosphere with its mighty wings. From time to time a flash of lightning stretched across the heavens like a fiery serpent, lighting up the clouds that rolled on in vast chaotic waves. Dantès had not been deceived. He had reached the first of the two islands, which was in fact Tiboulin. He knew that it was barren and without shelter, but when the sea became more calm, he resolved to plunge